This was a man who has tried to align himself when it comes to national service, the pensions announcement that he made earlier in the campaign. And here was something which actually showed that his natural instincts, this is the argument from Reform and Nigel Farage, were actually out of touch with that older generation of voters and the British public more widely.
Of course, it was an issue that dominated, some say perhaps it dominated too much last night's debate, because there are other subjects that lost time to this, subjects on climate, the economy, migration. However, let's set that aside. Are we any closer, Theo, to understanding what actually happened? Because from the Prime Minister's statement and what we've heard from Number 10, he was always planned to leave early. It's a bit unclear why the Prime Minister had always planned to leave early. We got to the bottom of what the original plans were.
Stephen Swinford's got a very good write-through in today's Times, Alexis, where he details how this plan was actually made before the general election. This wasn't necessarily a campaigning issue, that they needed more time, but actually the decision was made beforehand. They looked at the diary, and when they looked at the diary, they saw that it was a French event, that actually Rishi Sunak always intended to attend all of the British events, and he was very clear when he gave that apology on Twitter, and then also when he did a short interview yesterday that he attended the British events. But given that this was seen as something that was being organised by Emmanuel Macron's team, he didn't see it necessarily fit that he should attend. And of course, they realised the gravity of the mistake when there were those images, those pictures, weren't there? And it was Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, the Foreign Secretary, standing next to President Biden, President Macron, and of course Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. But what Number 10 we've been stressing is that actually this wasn't a decision that was made after the general election was called. And there was also another story that began to gain some traction yesterday, and this is something that's been denied vehemently by Number 10 and of course by the Prime Minister, that actually Rishi Sunak didn't plan to attend the event at all, and that leaving early was seen as a compromise. And of course that would, if that had gained, there was a debate about it, and something that Mr. Sunak's aides were absolutely clear, and Mr. Sunak himself was absolutely clear, was never going to be the case, that he would attend for the British veterans, but this was an international event. But clearly a huge misstep. And Nigel Farage zoning in there, and you played that excerpt of his exchanges with Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House, you played that exchange with Penny Mordaunt, and what was very interesting about that was he was going in on Sunak's instincts that he couldn't see. You know, this was a man who has tried to align himself when it comes to national service, the pensions announcement that he made earlier in the campaign. And here was something which actually showed that his natural instincts, this is the argument from Reform and Nigel Farage, were actually out of touch with that older generation of voters and the British public more widely.
Theo, let's have a closer look at Reform. It's an interesting exchange today on X, formerly known as Twitter. Andrea Jenkins really coming out quite vociferously against Reform, pointing out that she is standing against a Reform candidate, but in her neighbouring constituency, which is held by Labour's Hilary Benn, Reform are not putting up a candidate. And she sort of pointing out that actually Reform's sole purpose is to destroy the Conservative Party. And then that provoked quite an extraordinary response from Richard Tice, now the chairman of Reform, saying, well, you had your chance to jump ship, but you didn't.
Yes, and what's interesting about this is that there would have been perhaps, and this was a narrative that may still play out, but at the moment, and I read a very interesting interview you got in the Times today with Mr. Farage himself, where he says actually he's not quite sure how any future deal will be done between those Conservatives left and his own Reform Party, should we see Reform MPs enter the House of Commons on after July the 4th. And looking at the polls this week, it's looking fairly likely, given that two polls have put the gap between Tories and Reform at just 2 points. But what's interesting is that Nigel Farage, at the moment at least, and Richard Tice at the moment, aren't willing to try and do some sort of deal where they would approach Conservative MPs like Andrea Jenkins, and they would say, okay, you're more aligned with our beliefs, let's perhaps soft pedal in your constituencies or even try and support you, and then let's go after one nation Conservative MPs where they might be looking to win seats and actually try and lock them out, so that Reform actually is left with a Conservative Party which is much more reflective of its own particular views after the general election. And Andrew Jenkins' argument in this fairly, I've read the statement, it's a fairly desperate statement, is almost pleading with Nigel Farage and Richard Tice just to say, let's do a deal where the Conservative MPs, if you like, could get some sort of kite mark maybe from Reform, that they're signed up to their views and that they would work with Nigel Farage and anybody else who's elected for the party. But at the moment, Nigel Farage just seems intent on doing as much damage to the Conservative Party as possible, even if that potentially ends up leaving Keir Starmer with an even bigger majority than he would otherwise have in the House of Commons.
Theo, today the campaigns continue. The Conservatives have now pledged to scrap ULEZ charge for roads in outer London. The Lib Dems have promised to further protect the environment by creating 3 new national parks. And Labour have said that they will overhaul business rates to help high street shops. Going forward, I suppose next week is going to be manifesto week. Is that where we really can stop speculating about what the parties are going to do and how much it's going to cost, and actually get down to some nitty gritty?
I think manifesto week is always crucial, given that there isn't a huge amount of money to play with in terms of Labour and the Conservatives. They're both allocated around £6 billion, and both parties have made announcements which have counted for large proportions of that £6 billion, which they're going to raise through clamping down on tax evasion and tax avoidance. There may not be, in terms of the nitty gritty, Alexis, there isn't a huge amount to announce still, which is actually going to have cost implications, because of course there is not a huge amount of money in the coffers for either party after the general election. But I think it's going to be interesting. If you think back to 2017, the manifesto week was absolutely crucial. It's a banana skin of a week, really, isn't it? Because if you think of the dementia tax that undid Theresa May, if you think about how well Jeremy Corbyn did in 2017 when he announced nationalising rail services, it completely pivoted that campaign. I'm not sure this time around there is that necessarily we're going to see this. Parties seem to have learned their lesson. The major parties seem to have learned their lesson to treat manifesto week very cautiously, keep everything very tight, and make sure your sums add up, and don't do anything to potentially scare the horses. But we've had now a disastrous campaign from the Conservatives, and there's a real frustration on the Conservative backbenches. Matthew Parris writing that actually he thinks that there may be a case, even with 3.5 weeks to go, it perhaps isn't unprecedented for the Tories actually to think seriously about changing their leader now. And this is something that I'm hearing back as well. So it's one of those ones where we're in a very febrile state in this election campaign. It started off fairly run-of-the-mill, fairly boring. Okay, there are those gaffes. And then, of course, we've had these blunders, Nigel Farage entering the race, creating a completely different dynamic. And I think that manifesto week, they'll be looking to get to next Saturday, both Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak, and thinking about how they haven't messed up. Keir Starmer won't have dropped something, made a major error in his manifesto that will suddenly put off Labour voters or people who are thinking about voting Labour. And Rishi Sunak, well, after the week he's had, he needs something to go right fairly quickly.
Gosh, imagine that, changing leader at this stage of the campaign. Theo, as ever, thank you for your time. Theo Usherwood, there, Times Radio political correspondent.